The US coronavirus death toll reaches a grim milestone of 60,000, surpassing the loss of American life from the Vietnam War. The economy, meanwhile, had its worst quarter since 2008, amid calls to reopen businesses by right-wing groups and supporters of Donald Trump. French cabinet ministers hammer out the details of a plan to ease the country's COVID-19 lockdown from May the 11th. This as the rest of Europe eyes up ways of relaxing their own confinement orders. Also coming up this hour on France 24, banks are targeted in renewed protests across Lebanon as the currency loses more than half of its value. The country is grappling with its worst economic crisis since the 1975 to 1990 civil conflict. A very warm welcome back to France 24. I'm Sanam Chantier with those top stories for you at this hour. Now we start with new data from Johns Hopkins University. COVID-19 has infected more than 3.1 million people and killed more than 220,000 across the world. In Europe, with numbers dropping, several countries have begun to ease their lockdowns. Africa, for its part, is seeing a steep rise in coronavirus cases. Catherine Viet has that story.
With global infections topping 3 million people, the World Health Organization is warning the pandemic is far from over. The death toll continues to rise, with the virus killing more than 217,000 people. And in some parts of the world, infections are increasing. In India and Africa, confirmed cases are doubling in less than 2 weeks.
WHO continues to be concerned about the increasing trends in Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and some Asian countries. As in all regions, cases and deaths are underreported in many countries in these regions because of low testing capacity.
In Western Europe, there are signs the virus has peaked thanks to strict lockdown measures. In the hardest-hit countries, the number of new cases are falling, including Italy, the continent's most affected, with more than 27,000 deaths, as well as Spain and France, both with more than 23,000 dead. Their respective governments all acting to ease lockdown measures, following similar moves made by their neighbors in Northern Europe. With over 1 million people infected and 58,000 dead, the United States has the grim honor of being the country most severely impacted by the pandemic. Health officials there warning of the possibility of a second wave of infections after some states have gone ahead and lifted stay-at-home orders.
Let's shift the focus to Europe now. Germany's economy is bracing for its deepest recession since World War II. This as the country begins to ease commercial restrictions, and that hasn't come without a price. With the country very slowly reopening, the infection rate rose from 0.7% to 1.0%. Ellen Gainsford has that story.
Germany's population has been relatively spared from the coronavirus. Its economy less so. Europe's industrial powerhouse is preparing to live through its worst recession in 50 years.
Wir gehen davon aus, dass die Wirtschaft der Bundesrepublik Deutschland in diesem Jahr 6,3%. Wir hoffen, dass die Zahlen, die wir in den nächsten Tagen erhalten, dies auch tragen.
Coronavirus lockdowns here and abroad have hit the keystone of Germany's economy, its export industry, hard. But as the country loosens restrictions, its economy minister has warned it's important not to rush.
Meine Damen und Herren, es handelt sich einen Langstreckenlauf. Wir müssen mit unseren Kräften haushalten, wir müssen Schritt für Schritt vorgehen. Sonst gefährden wir die bisherigen Erfolge und machen die Konsequenzen gravierender und einschneidender.
Germany is not the only country facing an economic about-turn. In the US first quarter, gross domestic product is down 4.8%, off the back of a decade of growth.
Next to France, where the death toll has risen to 24,087 from 23,660 this day after Edouard Philippe announced the government's plan for deconfinement from May the 11th. and it looks set to be a phased process from an uptick in tests being carried out across the country. Now, the French Prime Minister also argued that a lengthy lockdown would have rather negative repercussions, further damaging the economy. Some, however, have argued that a prolonged confinement will help the economy in the long run, as well as saving lives.
Progressive steps for easing back into daily activities. That's the message from the French government. Companies and businesses can restart their operations as long as they respect safety regulations and social distancing rules. With France's GDP expected to drop by 8% this year, the country is facing an unprecedented economic crisis. The finance minister calling for unity in the face of such hardship.
Nous devons retourner au travail, nous devons reprendre notre activité et nous devons le faire tous ensemble en regardant dans un esprit de solidarité et de responsabilité comment est-ce que nous pouvons réussir ce retour à l'activité.
And to ease the transition back to work, children can return to school, but again, it will be phased in and optional. Kindergartens and elementary schools will reopen on May 11th, with middle schools welcoming students a week later. A final decision has yet to be made about high schools. However, it is mayors who will have the final say, taking into account the impact of the virus on the community, a decision supported by the Prime Minister.
Il y aura des différenciations, y compris parfois à l'intérieur d'une commune. Mais après tout, on peut l'accepter. L'important, c'est que tout le monde reprenne le chemin de l'école, mais qu'on prenne en compte la situation particulière quand elle se présente à l'intérieur même d'une commune.
Bars and restaurants will have to wait a bit longer. Officials say a decision on when they can reopen will be made at the end of May.
Now, as we've been saying throughout the programme, across Europe, countries are taking very different measures to ease their lockdowns as infection rates slow and death rates decline. For more on this story, I'd like to bring in Catherine Nicholson, our European Affairs editor. She joins us from Bristol in the United Kingdom. Catherine, thank you so much for being with us. In that earlier report, we heard about the key points about France's lockdown exit plan. How does this compare to other countries across the continent?
Well, it is somewhat of a patchwork, to be honest. The European Commission had wanted there to be a coordinated lifting of lockdown restrictions, but that doesn't seem to be what's coming together. Each country is making its own decisions on major issues at this point. That said, France does have much in common with many of its closest neighbours. For example, in terms of maintaining social distancing and bringing in restrictions on how people behave on public transport, in shops, all that sort of thing. So one area where we can quite concretely make comparisons is on the wearing of masks. In France and in Belgium, masks will be mandatory on public transport, for example. In Germany and Italy, that will be extended as well to shops, whereas in France it will be up to shopkeepers to decide. In Spain, which has the highest death toll in Europe, the wearing of masks on public transport is recommended but not mandatory at this point. Perhaps paradoxical, but we are told that this is in large part down to the fact that there's a major shortage of masks in Spain. The UK, which today became the country to surpass 29,000 recorded deaths from COVID-19 and the second highest death toll in Europe, still somewhat of an unknown quantity when it comes to easing of restrictions. The Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab, who was standing in for Boris Johnson today at Prime Minister's questions, said that the UK is still passing through the peak of its infections and deaths from COVID-19. We're not hearing anything about easing of restrictions yet, despite somewhat of a clamour from opposition politicians and the government's own Conservative Party politicians. But the Prime Minister's spokesman said today that we're not going to expect to hear any announcements about easing of restrictions in the United Kingdom this week. Countries all across Europe are very keen, of course, to restart their economies. Austria led the way, the Chancellor talking about getting the economy restarted when he made those announcements. But all countries are keeping a very close eye on the infection rate, very concerned in case easing restrictions means that there is a new spike in infections and in deaths.
Now, Catherine, to a question that's very much on all our lips, and it's all about, obviously, the summer vacations. Will we be able to travel?
It's a big question, isn't it? And the European Commissioner for Consumer Protection, Věra Jourová, spoke about this today. She said that the European Commission is very keen for European states to reopen their borders to international travellers as soon as possible with, she said, of course, restrictions in place to protect health. But there's a real fear from the European Commission that the tourism sector could be badly damaged. Věra Jourová said that there could be a halving of turnover in the tourism sector this year. This is a sector that accounts for 10% of Europe's economic output, and millions of jobs depend upon it. So it is up to each state to decide. At this point, some countries still got very strict restrictions in place. Austria entirely sealed off until early May. Poland also closed off and putting any Poles who return home into 14-day mandatory quarantine. Others, though, are easing things up a little bit. The Czech Republic allowing business travellers in from elsewhere in the EU for 72 hours if they have a negative COVID-19 test. And Germany is advising its own citizens against international travel until June the 14th, but perhaps saying that it could be possible after that. Again, the United Kingdom, as I said, the foreign minister standing in for the Prime Minister said that the peak is still with the United Kingdom, and it is not clear at this point when British people are going to be encouraged to start travelling internationally once again.
Catherine Nicholson, thank you so much for bringing us that update, the situation across Europe. Now, the COVID-19 outbreak put a damper on months of protests in Lebanon, but earlier this week, hundreds took to the streets once again, from Beirut to Tripoli in the north. Demonstrators set fire to banks amid a mounting currency crisis and unemployment. The country faces its most severe economic crisis in decades, and that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Now, earlier I spoke to our regional correspondent Leila Moulana Alan and asked her about these protests restarting. Let's take a listen.
Since really February, the protests have hugely died down because, of course, the country was locked down, and the government seems to have done quite well in controlling the spread of COVID-19 here. But that's because they almost immediately shut down all businesses, restaurants, stopped allowing taxis, all sorts of things, which meant that they were able to stop the disease spreading, but massively exacerbated the economic crisis, which was already dogging the country. Now, this week, they announced measures to start slowly easing off over the next 6 weeks, partly because of pressure from people saying that they were on the point of starvation, and poverty has escalated so rapidly over the last 2 months. And people seem to take that as a sign that it was the next stage now. The protests are back from the beginning of the week when Parliament sat for the first time since the outbreak. People spread on the streets across the country, but the main place was in Tripoli, where for the last 3 days we've seen banks being burned, lots of violence between the army and security forces and protesters out there. And just 2 days ago, a young man was shot. They were using live bullets, which has been very rare during the Beirut protests. The young man was shot and he did die. And so yesterday, people out on the streets violently protesting against the army, saying, we're out here asking for our rights, asking to be fed, asking for our government to do something for us, and you're killing our young people. Huge anger, particularly in that city.
That was Leila Moulana Alan with that update from Beirut. That's it from me and the team at this hour on France 24. Thank you so much for watching. You can, of course, get our updates on our website. That's www.france24.com. Do stay tuned and stay safe.